Okay, stick with me if you can, because this is a long and complex discussion, probably not one suited to just a couple of minutes on social media, but I'll give it my best shot. I've been pondering this for a couple of days now, since the 100 female footballers sent a letter to Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA, asking for a sponsorship of Aramco, the Saudi oil giant, to be cancelled because they don't believe that that company stands for the same rights that they stand for. One being the climate and what is happening around the world, and not sufficient work is being done by Aramco to address that. But the other, and probably more importantly from their perspective, is the battle for LGBTQI rights. And they say the women in Saudi Arabia are not supported in the same way that they think they should be, and that the sponsorship is at odds with those beliefs. This brings into question a whole lot of other areas, and as I said at the beginning, they're kind of complex. I always look at these sorts of issues, and I look for the voice of those who are most impacted. So these 100 women have said that, you know, women's football has gone to great heights and strengths following the FIFA World Cup in 2023, and we all agree with that. That is so true. They say that this sponsorship deal is like a kick in the guts. I'm not sure about that, because when you start looking at, you know, the struggle that these women have had, and football to be recognised in the same sorts of terms that men's football has been for many years, you know, the growth has gone like this, and it's been remarkable. But by the same token, you can also look at what's happened in Saudi Arabia in the past, well, not even a decade, less than a decade, and what has happened for the rights of women. And yes, there are still some detained because they sent social media posts asking for freedom of speech. And that should not happen. We get that. And laws should be addressed. We get that. But women have gone from not being able to drive and not being involved in any of the normal day-to-day business economic sectors to now being involved in every single sector. Women now also have positions of authority. We also hear those Saudi voices, but we never do when we have campaigns like this. Now, I went back another step further, and I had a look at, I thought this is grassroots, you know, formations of people standing up for what they believe in is a good thing, providing they also have access to all the information to back up what they're calling for. Now, this letter has been put out by a group called Athletes of the World. If you go onto the Athletes of the World website, you see that they run a number of campaigns, mostly based around fixing climate change, fixing what is going on and looking at solutions for the environment. Again, completely worthy. But you can't find anything on that website about who's funding this lobby group. Is it a lobby group? You know, how did they come to access these athletes? And my concern always is that you don't want athletes being used in a way that maybe they haven't been fully informed or briefed. Maybe they have. But we also hear other voices as well, and I think it's important these voices are not showcased in the media quite the same way, because it doesn't fit the narrative, it doesn't fit the agenda. Now, one of those voices is an Australian academic, Ryan Storr. This is what he's had to say, not about this issue specifically, but a couple of days previously he put this message out.
I've seen that there's been a bit of media around sport events in the Middle East again. So I think it's the World Surfing Association that is choosing to have their championships there. This is not new. The WTA season-ending championships in tennis is happening in Saudi Arabia in November, and there's been discussions around that. For example, Daria Kasatkina, who's in a same-sex relationship, has spoken out about it, and there has been some discussions within the context of women's tennis, so it's not new. I think it's really important to understand that there are kind of multiple perspectives to consider. One is that it's okay for kind of Western media and people to comment about how bad it is, and that often in those areas homosexuality can be given the death penalty and illegal and those type of things. But we also need to understand the context of LGBTQI plus people within those regions and how potentially sport could be a positive thing. So for example, a couple of years back, some advocates from Russia got in touch with me around when all the events were happening in Russia, and they were basically saying that there needs to be a lot less calls to boycott it, because from their perspective, especially at the time when gay men were being killed in Chechnya, nobody would have known about that unless they actually had those sports events there to raise awareness around it. So from their perspective, they want these sports events happening there because then it can be leveraged to help LGBT people in those regions. So there needs to be a solid plan to say, we understand that the context is difficult and that the human rights of LGBTQI plus people is not what we would like it to be. However, we're hoping to do X, Y, and Z, and we hope that through the medium of sport and these events, we can maybe help raise awareness and those type of things.
You know, I've also been lucky enough to live in the Middle East for a couple of years, and I really enjoyed that experience, getting to know the people, the locals, as much as I could in my limited time there. A couple of years spent in the UAE and travelling to Qatar numerous times for work and other countries in the region. I haven't been to Saudi, so I'm reluctant to give a perspective on Saudi other than from what I've heard from fellow colleagues who've gone and lived and worked there, many of whom still do, and from friends and acquaintances, people that I've spoken to, friends of friends who are from there and who've spoken about the incredible change that has happened. We haven't had that sort of a cultural shift in our communities that quickly, and I think it is important to recognise those sorts of gains while also recognising that it would be great for some other changes to happen as well. That is also not to say that I think everywhere should be the same as us, because people are entitled to determine what their culture is, what they stand for, and how they live what they see as their best lives. Now, this is a really interesting thing. I went searching for any kind of academic work that had been done by a Saudi person and a gay person, and actually I did find something. Now, I'm not going to identify this person because I think in the climate that would be really unfair, and in fact what he wrote in his thesis probably also supports that position. Western, mostly white gay rights activists tend to ignore the practices and beliefs of the people that they are determined to liberate. They ignore the people, their needs, positions, and focus on the government. They forget that how they criticise and fight those regimes and governments has a direct effect on those people they claim to want to liberate and secure and protect their existence. They are so focused on the concept of liberation and fighting corrupt governments that they ignore those who are sceptical of their agenda behind the human rights, gay rights, Western discourse. They constantly shift their focus to governments, claiming that LGBT rights call into question government's authority to regulate morality for a purported social good. Again, focusing on making the issue of sex and same-sex practices, which happens privately, without the knowledge of the government, an activist versus government issue. He goes on to say, so when people start to think of how those other Western states wish to protect the gay rights overseas, it becomes very clear that it is less about actual rights, actual protections, and more about dominance, superiority, and imperialism. Because basically his paper argues that sexual practices of any kind, heterosexual, homosexual, whatever label you want to apply, are done in private, out of the view of the eyes of the government. So it's only if you threaten the laws against public displays such as this that those very prohibitive laws come into play. Otherwise, it's done privately and out of the gaze, out of the attention, out of the domain of the government and the lawmakers. That's a very different thing to hear, where public displays are not only seen as the norm, but are encouraged. It's a very different cultural backdrop. But one of the other voices I saw was Hedvig Lindahl, who was the goalkeeper for the Sweden national team. She sent this tweet: I was asked to sign this. I said I think we should start with opposing the genocide. Then I'm happy to join in other fights, which are also important. So far, no joint initiatives from the football world against the genocide. Why? So these are really complex issues. It's impossible to go, this is 100% right, this is 100% wrong, because there are all of these intricacies in between that we need to really look at and think about very carefully. Women's football has grown exponentially. It has been a safe space for traditionally marginalised groups. That is also a great thing. But in celebrating that inclusiveness, we also have to be very careful that we don't become exclusionary and block out a whole region of people because we don't like their governments, or we don't like a certain sponsor because it comes from this particular part of the world. Aramco, interestingly, has been sponsoring women's sport, golf and tennis, for many years. It also exports all around the world. We import oil from Saudi Arabia here in Australia too. It helps fuel the cars that we drive. It helps fuel the planes that many of these women footballers fly on as they, go to their domestic leagues, whichever part of the world they're playing in, or as part of representative and national teams that fly to compete in world events. The FIFA Women's World Cup, which is at the heart of this very celebration, was sponsored by Qatar Airways, which, runs on fuel. There were no complaints from the women about the sponsorship from Qatar Airways back in FIFA 2023. And that also makes me think about the fact that when we had the FIFA World Cup here in Australia and New Zealand, I don't remember seeing many headlines or these calls or signatures of the players complaining about the fact that Australia has some of the harshest lock-up laws for children as young as 10 years of age, some who are being detained in adult facilities, and most of those children are black children from extremely marginalised communities. There was no outrage about that. And so I do wonder sometimes with these things, who is briefing these athletes? I fully support them standing up for what they believe are the best ideals morally and ethically for them to live their lives. But let's not also forget that this is a complex picture and it's not always something that's happening over there. And sometimes the way we approach these discussions are not really helping the people over there that we say we care about.